The wall of brown water hit the willow brake like a fist, and Elsie Crawford heard it before she saw it, a roar that rolled down Larkspur Canyon faster than any horse could run. She had been kneeling in the ditch behind her bunkhouse, trying by lantern light to clear a jam of branches from the head gate so the last trickle of irrigation water would not be lost, when the sound changed. It went from a distant grumble to a je, ive au ikratkoi, breathing thing, and the ground under her boots began to hum. She looked up the wash and saw, in the thin light of a gibbous moon, a wave taller than a wagon rolling toward her, carrying pine logs and boulders the size of hogsheads. She had no time to think about the drought that had starved this canyon for 11 months. No time to marvel at the cruelty of a cloudburst finally breaking over the high country, only to come down all at once and murder everything in its path. She had time only to drop the shovel and run for the gravel bar that jutted into the river below her orchard, because it was the only ground nearby that stood higher than the ditch, and because her feet, without asking her permission, had already decided that was where safety was. It was a mistake, and she knew it the instant the water closed around the bar on both sides, turning her narrow strip of gravel into an island. The flood did not care that she had lived in this canyon her whole life, that her father had planted these apple trees with his own hands the year before he died, that she had exactly $40 left to her name, and every one of those dollars was standing in root and branch behind her. It simply came, black and cold and full of the mountain's grief, and it did not slow. She screamed once, not for herself, but because the water had begun to eat the edges of the bar, and she understood with sudden, sick clarity that in a few minutes there would be no bar left to stand on. That was when she saw the rider. He came down off the ridge trail at a speed that should have killed both him and his horse, a big paint gelding lunging and skidding through wet talus, and the man on its back rode low and easy, the way she had heard men could only ride after years in the cavalry, where a fall meant more than a broken arm. He was enormous in the moonlight, shoulders wide enough to block a doorway, his dark hair long and loose beneath a weathered hat, and he came off that ridge like the mountain itself had decided to intervene. "Get to the trees," he bellowed, and his voice carried over the flood the way thunder carries over open plain. "Climb and hold on." She did not know him. She had heard of him, the mountain man who lived somewhere above the canyon rim and came down twice a season to trade furs, the one the miners called dangerous, and the women in town crossed the street to avoid, the one they said had scouted for the army against the Ute, and had a look in his eye like he had seen the inside of hell. She had never spoken 2 words to him in her life. But she scrambled up the nearest apple tree anyway, because his voice had the particular calm of a man who had given orders in worse chaos than this and been obeyed, and because the alternative was to stand on a shrinking spit of gravel and drown. The water reached her waist by the time he got the paint into the current. She watched him fight the horse sideways against the flow, angling not straight across but downstream and across at once, using the current instead of fighting it head-on, and she understood in that instant that whatever else people said about him, the man could read moving water the way she read soil. "Reach for me," he shouted, close now, close enough that she could see his eyes, gray-green and steady, fixed on her and nothing else. "Now, miss, I will not miss." She let go of the branch and reached, and his arm, thick with muscle earned from years of hard use rather than vanity, closed around her waist like a manacle, and he hauled her up and across the saddle in front of him as though she weighed nothing at all. The horse staggered, found its footing, staggered again, and then they were moving, angling hard for the high bank, the flood clawing at the gelding's hindquarters the whole way. They came up out of the water onto the old stage road, and the paint stood there blowing and trembling, and Elsie Crawford, soaked through and shaking so hard her teeth clattered, found herself pressed against a chest like a wall of warm stone, held there by an arm that did not loosen even after the danger had passed. "You are safe," the man said. His voice had dropped from the parade ground bellow to something quieter, rough at the edges. "You are safe now. I have got you." "My trees," she said, because it was the only thing she could think to say, foolish as it sounded even to her own ears. "My father's trees. We will see to them come daylight," he said. "Tonight we see to you." He did not let her walk to her own bunkhouse. He carried her because her legs would not hold her, and he built up the stove without being asked, and he draped his own coat, still smelling of pine sap and horse, over her shoulders, and he sat outside her door on an overturned nail keg until dawn, keeping watch over a woman he had known for less than an hour, because the flood was not yet finished with the canyon, and he did not trust it to leave her be twice in one night. His name, she learned before he left her at the door, was Grant Wallace. Dawn came gray and merciless, and with it came the frost. It was the cruelest trick a drought year could play, and Elsie understood the mechanics of it even through her exhaustion. The cloudburst that had sent the flood roaring down the canyon had also dragged a mass of high, cold air down off the peaks behind it, the kind of clear, still, killing cold that settled into low ground on windless nights and turned every bit of moisture to ice. Her orchard, already weakened by 11 months without proper rain, its roots half drowned now by the flood that had surged up the ditch and soaked the ground before receding, had no strength left to fight a hard freeze on top of everything else. The blossoms that had opened 3 days before, fragile and white, and full of the only promise she had left for the year's fruit, hung black and curled on every branch when she walked out among the trees that morning. She had not meant for anyone to see her cry. She had survived a flood in the night, and she told herself that a woman who had done that had no business weeping over flowers. But when she reached the third row, the row her father had planted the spring before he died, and saw that every blossom on every branch had gone the color of a bruise, something in her simply broke, and she sank down into the mud between the trees and put her face in her hands and sobbed like a child. She did not hear Grant Wallace's boots in the wet grass until he was close enough that his shadow fell across her. "Miss Crawford." She looked up, mortified, swiping at her face with a sleeve already filthy from the flood. "Mr. Wallace, I did not hear you. I am sorry, I must look a fright." "You look like a woman who has had a hard night and a harder morning," he said, and crouched down beside her, close enough that she could see the years in his face, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into weather, not from age. He was younger than she had first thought in the moonlight, not much past 30, though something in his bearing made him seem older. "This whole orchard, it is your father's work." "Was," she said. "He is 3 years dead. It is mine now for whatever that is worth, which this morning appears to be nothing." He reached out without asking permission and closed his hand gently around a blackened blossom, turning the branch so he could look at the bud beneath it. His hands, she noticed, were enormous, scarred across the knuckles, the hands of a man who had done violence and hard labor both, and yet the way he held that fragile, ruined little flower was careful as a surgeon. "The bloom is lost," he said. "That is true, and I will not lie to you and say otherwise, but look here." He pressed his thumbnail into the bud beneath the blackened petals, and green showed beneath, faint but alive. "The wood is not dead, only the flower. A tree can lose a season's fruit and still live to bear again." "A season's fruit is all I have," Elsie said. "I sell preserves and dried apples to the mining camps to keep this place fed through winter, Mr. Wallace. I owe on my father's note at the bank in Cascade Forks, and I owe the Prute Mining Company for water they say I have been taking without proper right, though the ditch was dug by my father 20 years before Silas Prute ever set a boot in this canyon. If this crop fails, I do not know how I hold this land another year." He was quiet for a moment, studying her, and she had the strange sensation of being weighed and measured by a man who did not waste words on people he found wanting. "I scouted for the cavalry 11 years, he said finally. "I have seen drought kill whole valleys, seen creeks I thought would run forever go dry as a bone, seen good land turn to dust under a bad year. I have also seen orchards come back from worse than a night's frost, if somebody is willing to fight for them." He rose and pulled her up with him, his grip firm but careful, and did not let go of her hand right away. "I am not a man who makes promises he does not intend to keep, Miss Crawford. I promise you a better spring. Not this year's, maybe, but a better one is coming, and I mean to help you see it through to blossom." She looked up at him, this man the town feared, this stranger who had pulled her out of a flood and now stood in her ruined orchard promising her seasons he had no earthly right to promise, and something in her chest, some small stubborn ember that the frost had not managed to kill after all, caught and held. "Why?" she asked. "You do not know me, Mr. Wallace." "No," he agreed. "But I know a woman who climbed a tree instead of giving up, and I know an orchard a man loved enough to plant with his own 2 hands. That is enough to be going on with." Word of the flood ran through the canyon faster than the water itself had run, and by the time Elsie made it into the settlement 2 days later to see about seed and grafting stock, half of Larkspur Crossing already knew that the mountain man had ridden into a flash flood to pull the orchard woman off a gravel island, and most of them had an opinion about what it meant. "They say he carried you clean into your own house," said Ada Sims, who ran the mercantile and considered gossip a civic duty. "Carried you like a sack of flour, Nell Foster tells it, though how Nell Foster would know I could not say, since she was 2 miles off at the time." "He carried me because I could not stand," Elsie said, counting out coins for a sack of bone meal she could barely afford. "The water had near drowned me, Ada, not swept me off my feet in the way you are imagining." "All the same," Ada said, lowering her voice as though the words themselves were dangerous, "a woman ought to be careful of a man like that. They say he did terrible things scouting for the army. They say he can track a man for 100 miles and never lose the trail, and that he learned some of that in ways a Christian man would not care to learn anything." Elsie thought of the careful way those scarred hands had held a ruined blossom and set her jaw. "He pulled me out of a flood, Ada, and he has spent every day since helping me save what is left of my father's trees. I will judge the man by what I have seen him do, not by what men who have never spoken 2 words to him choose to say about him over a counter." Ada sniffed, unconvinced, but Elsie did not linger to argue further. She had grafting to do, and precious little daylight left to do it in. It was on her way out of the mercantile that she nearly collided with Silas Prout. He was not a large man, not in the way Grant Wallace was large, but he carried himself as though the canyon belonged to him, which in a great many practical respects it now did. He owned the Sentinel mine that sat 2,000 feet above the settlement on the canyon rim. He owned the single wooden trestle bridge that was the only way to move ore carts and freight wagons across the gorge to the rail depot at the canyon mouth. And in a drought year, with every spring on the mountain running thin, he had lately taken to reminding people that he also controlled the flow of Larkspur Creek above the point where it split to feed both his mine's flume and the settlement's irrigation ditches. "Miss Crawford," he said, touching his hat with a courtesy that did not reach his eyes, "I hear you had quite a night of it in the flood. And I hear you have taken up with the Wallace fellow since." "I have taken up with no one, Mr. Prout," Elsie said. "Mr. Wallace pulled me out of the river and has since been kind enough to help with my trees. That is the whole of it." "Of course," Prout said, in the mild tone of a man who did not believe a word he had just been told and did not much care whether she knew it. "I only mention it because I have been meaning to speak with you about your water claim. In a year like this, with my mine's own works running short, the company cannot in good conscience keep honoring an old hand-dug ditch when the original filing is, shall we say, imprecise as to boundaries. My lawyer in Cascade Forks tells me your father's claim was never properly recorded with the territorial engineer. It would be a shame to see a dispute over a few inches of water come between neighbors." "It would be a greater shame," Elsie said, "to see a man with a mine full of ore and a payroll of 200 try to starve out one woman with 40 apple trees, Mr. Prout. My father dug that ditch before your company had so much as staked a claim in this canyon, and I intend to keep drawing water from it exactly as he did." Prout smiled, the smile of a man who had heard defiance before and found it more amusing than alarming. "We shall see what the engineer's office has to say about that when the surveyor comes through this summer. Good day, Miss Crawford. Do give my regards to your mountain man." He walked on, and Elsie stood in the dust of the street with her jaw clenched so tight it ached, thinking that whatever else the frost had taken from her that spring, it had not taken her willingness to fight. Grant found her an hour later, mending a break in the ditch fence with more force than the task strictly required, and when she told him what Prout had said, something shifted behind his eyes, a stillness that she would come to recognize over the following weeks as the particular quiet of a man deciding how much of his anger to let show. "He has been buying up water rights all along this canyon for 2 years, Grant said. "I have seen the surveys he has had run, quiet, up past the forks where his mine's tailings pond sits. A man does not spend that kind of money on lawyers and surveys, because he is worried about a few inches of an old woman's ditch, Elsie. He is clearing the ground for something bigger." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she noticed it the way she noticed the warmth that spread through her chest at the sound of it, and decided, for the moment, to let both things pass without comment. "Then we had better find out what that something is," she said, "before he decides my orchard is standing in the way of it." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that Elsie would remember, long afterward, as some of the hardest and sweetest of her life. Grant came down from his cabin on the ridge most mornings before the sun cleared the canyon wall, and together they worked the orchard back toward life. He showed her how to build low smudge fires of damp sawdust and green wood between the rows on nights when frost threatened again, fires that burned slow and smoky, and kept just enough warmth trapped near the ground to spare a tender bud. He climbed trees she could not reach to cut away deadwood, moving through the branches with a surprising, careful grace for a man his size, and she learned that beneath the scarred and weathered exterior the town found so fearsome, there was a patience in him that most men, in her experience, did not trouble themselves to cultivate. "You are gentler with those branches than half the men in this canyon are with their own children," she told him one afternoon, watching him ease a splint of grafting wax around a cut limb. He did not look up from his work right away. "A scout learns to be careful," he said. "Careless men in that line of work do not live to grow old. I suppose the habit stayed with me after the reason for it went away." "Is that why you left the cavalry? The reason went away?" He was quiet long enough that she thought she had overstepped, and began to apologize, but he shook his head before she could finish. "I left because I stopped believing in what they had me tracking men for," he said. "The last 2 years I scouted, it was not soldiers I was finding trails for, Elsie. It was families. Ute families who had done nothing but try to stay ahead of an army that had already broken every promise made to them. I was good at my work. I found every trail I was set to find. And every time I found one, something in me broke a little more, until I could not tell any more whether I was a scout or a bloodhound, and I did not care for the answer either way that question might have gone." He set the grafting knife down and looked at her, and there was no softness left in his face, only a raw, old grief. "I came up into these mountains because I did not trust myself around people anymore. I thought if I lived alone long enough, I might forget how to be the man the army made of me." "And did you forget?" she asked gently. "No," he said, "but I have found since the flood that I do not much want to any more." She reached out without quite deciding to, and laid her hand over his scarred one where it rested on the graft he had just wrapped, and neither of them spoke for a long while after that, and it did not feel like it needed saying. The blizzard came on them without warning, the way spring storms in that country so often did, dropping out of a sky that had been clear an hour before, and caught Elsie and Grant 3 miles up the canyon at the old line shack that had once sheltered her father's sheep before he switched over to orchard entirely. They had ridden up to check a spring that fed a smaller side ditch, the one Prout's surveyor had not yet gotten around to disputing, and by the time the first fat flakes began to fall, the wind had already turned bitter enough to burn exposed skin. "We will not make it back before dark," Grant said, watching the wall of gray coming down off the peaks with the flat, assessing look of a man who had learned the hard way not to argue with weather. "The shack is closer than home. We go there." They reached it with snow already stinging sideways into their faces, and Grant kicked the door open against a drift and got the horses into the linta before he so much as thought of the fire, which told Elsie something about the order of his priorities that she found, despite the cold, unaccountably endearing. The shack was one room, low-roofed, with a stone hearth at one end and a single narrow cot along the wall, and by the time Grant had a fire going and hung a blanket to dry the worst of the wet from their coats, the wind outside had risen to a howl that made the whole structure shudder. "We are not getting out tonight," he said, feeding another split log to the flames. "Might be we are not getting out tomorrow morning either, depending how hard she blows." "I have spent worse nights than this in worse company," Elsie said, settling onto the floor near the hearth with her knees drawn up, and was rewarded with the sight of Grant Wallace, fearsome mountain man, ducking his head to hide what was unmistakably a grin. They ate the last of the biscuits she had packed for the ride, and shared the single tin cup of coffee boiled bitter and strong over the fire. And as the storm screamed outside and the little shack held warm and close around them, the conversation between them turned, without either of them quite steering it there, toward the things they did not usually say aloud. "My father used to tell me," Elsie said, watching the fire, "that a tree does not know it is going to die in a frost. It only knows the season it is in. He said people would do well to take a lesson from that and not spend so much time grieving winters that had not come yet." "Wise man," Grant said. "He was mostly." He was also stubborn as a mule, and he never once in 20 years of farming this canyon admitted that a piece of ground had beaten him, right up until the fever took him, and there was nothing left for him to admit anything at all. She wrapped her arms tighter around her knees. "I sometimes think I have inherited more of his stubbornness than his good sense, Mr. Wallace." "Grant," he said, "I believe we have gone through a flood and a blizzard together, Elsie Crawford. I think we have earned first names." "Grant, then." She smiled at him, small and real. "I think, whatever they say of you in town, my father would have liked you. He did not trust men who talked too much or too smooth. He always said the ones worth knowing were the ones who did their talking with their hands." "Then I hope my hands have been saying something decent these past weeks," Grant said, and there was a low, careful warmth in his voice that made her look up and find him watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with orchards or ditches or floods. She did not look away. "They have," she said. "They have said a great deal, actually." He moved to sit beside her, close enough that the warmth of him competed with the fires, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the storm howling its argument against the walls while something quieter and infinitely more patient built itself in the space between their two bodies. "I have not wanted to want anything in a long time," Grant said finally, his voice rough. "It felt safer up on that mountain not to want. Wanting things is how a man gets hurt." "I have not had the luxury of not wanting things," Elsie said. "I want this orchard to live. I want to keep the last thing my father made with his own 2 hands. And I find lately that I want other things besides, things I had put away because I did not think a woman fighting for 40 acres of trees had any business wanting a man at all. And now," she said, "I think perhaps I have been wrong about a good many things." He kissed her then, slow and careful, the way he did everything that mattered to him, one enormous hand coming up to cradle the side of her face as though she were something rare and easily broken, though she suspected, from the way she kissed him back, that he was already beginning to learn otherwise. When they finally drew apart, the fire had burned low and neither of them had noticed, and the storm outside had begun at last to quiet. "A better spring," he murmured against her hair. "I meant it for the orchard when I said it. I find I mean it for a good deal more than that now." "Then we had better both of us live to see it," she said, and settled against his chest and slept for the first time since the flood without dreaming of drowning water at all. It was 10 days after the blizzard, with the orchard showing its first stubborn new leaf buds and the melt swelling every creek in the high country, that Abel Foster came pounding up to Elsie's porch on a borrowed mule, his old face gray with more than exertion. "Miss Elsie, you had best come," he said, not bothering to dismount properly, half falling off the mule in his haste. "It is the Dunmore family down along the flats. Both the little ones took sick in the night, fever and their bellies cramping something terrible, and now I hear the Acafer boy from the mine's bunkhouse has come down the same way, and old widow Tarrant besides. Doc Mercer is run near off his feet." "Sick how?" Elsie asked, already reaching for her shawl. "Doc says it is something in the water," Abel said. "Says it has the look of what the army calls camp fever from bad drinking water, only he cannot say why it should strike now, when the creek is running as clean as it is all spring." Grant, who had been grafting a stubborn old pear tree at the far end of the row, was already moving toward the horses before Abel finished speaking, and Elsie found herself moving with him without needing to be asked. They found the Dunmore cabin already crowded with worried neighbors, the two children pale and sweating in their beds, and Doc Mercer, a thin, exhausted man with spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose, wringing his hands over a basin of well water he had drawn that morning. "I have seen this before," he told them low, when Grant drew him aside. "Not often, thank God, but I have seen it. It is a sickness that comes from water fouled with something a body should not drink, mineral poisoning most like, though I cannot yet say from what. It builds in a person slow, then strikes all at once when the body can bear no more of it. Whatever is doing this, it has been in that water some while." "Which water?" Grant asked. "That is the trouble," Mercer said. "The Dunmores draw from the creek below the forks. The Acafer boy drinks from the company well at the bunkhouse, which the mine fills from a cistern fed off the same creek, higher up, nearer the tailings pond. And Widow Tarrant has her own spring, but it runs off the same slope." He looked between them, weary and afraid. "I went to Mr. Prude a week past when I first suspected, and asked leave to test the water above his tailings pond. He told me the pond was sound, that his engineer had certified it, and that I would do well not to go spreading talk that might frighten off investors in a drought year, when the company was the only thing keeping half this canyon fed." Elsie felt something cold settle in her stomach. "He knew," she said. "He knew, and he told you to be quiet about it." "He did not say it in so many words," Mercer said, "but I understood him well enough." Grant's jaw had gone tight in that way Elsie had learned meant he was holding down something dangerous. "I scouted enough poisoned water in the army to know the smell of a tailings leak when I am standing near one," he said. "Arsenic, most like, or some cousin of it, leaching down off crushed ore into groundwater. It would explain a fever that builds slow and strikes sudden, and it would explain why my own creek water, which comes off a different fold of the mountain entirely, has never given me trouble." He looked at Elsie. "It would also explain, better than any drought, why your father's ditch has run thinner every year since the mine opened. The company has not only been taking water above you. They may have been ruining what they left behind." "We have to see that pond," Elsie said. "We do," Grant agreed, "and we have to do it before Prude has time to hide what is wrong with it." They rode up past the forks the next morning before first light, leaving the horses tied a half-mile below the mine works, and going the rest of the way on foot through timber, Grant moving with the silent, economical care of a man who had spent 11 years making sure the ground never learned his footsteps. Elsie kept pace beside him, her boots sure on the loose scree, and when they came out above the tailings pond and looked down on it in the gray early light, she understood at once why Prude had been so anxious to keep the doctor away. The pond's earthen dam, meant to hold back the gray, chemical-laced sludge left over from crushing and refining ore, had a long crack running down its face, weeping a thin, rust-colored seep that trickled down through the rocks toward the creek below, exactly where Larkspur Creek split to feed both the mine's cistern and, further down, her own irrigation ditch. "There," Grant said quietly, crouching at the edge of the seep, and letting a little of the discolored water run over his fingers before wiping them clean on his trousers with obvious distaste. "That is your poison, and it has likely been leaking since before the drought ever started, only there was more clean water in the creek then to thin it down. Now that every spring on this mountain is running low, there is not enough clean water left to dilute what is coming through that crack." "He has known," Elsie said, staring down at the ruined dam with a fury that surprised her in its intensity. "He has known his pond was cracked, and rather than spend the money to fix it, he let it leak into water that feeds his own workers, and half the families in this canyon besides. And when I told him my orchard's water was mine by right, he tried to steal the claim rather than admit his own works were the reason the water had gone bad in the first place. We need proof he knew," Grant said. "Proof and witnesses, and we need to get word to the territorial mining inspector before Prout has a chance to patch that crack over and swear it was never there." "Doc Mercer said Prout had an engineer certify the pond was sound," Elsie said slowly. "If that engineer's report exists on paper, and if it says something different than what we are standing in front of right now, that is proof enough for any inspector worth his salt." "Then we find that report," Grant said, "and we do it before Prout learns we have been up here." They did not manage either quickly enough. They were halfway back down toward the horses when 3 of Prout's men came through the timber on foot, led by his mine foreman, a broad, sour-faced man named Reeves who Elsie had seen collecting tolls at the bridge more than once and had never liked the look of. "This is company land," Reeves said, planting himself in the trail with his hand resting meaningfully on the pistol at his hip, the other 2 men fanning out behind him with rifles held loose but ready. "You have got no business up here, Wallace, and neither does she." "We have got every business," Grant said, and though his voice stayed level, Elsie felt the change in him, the way his whole body had gone still and coiled, a man assessing threat and distance and angle without appearing to move at all. "That pond of yours is cracked and leaking poison into water half this canyon drinks. Children are sick down at the Dunmore place because of it. That is everyone's business, Reeves, company land or no." "That pond is sound," Reeves said, though something flickered behind his eyes that told Elsie he knew better. "Mr. Prout's own engineer certified it not 2 months past." "Then Mr. Prout's engineer is either a fool or a liar," Grant said, "and I would wager money it is the second, since a fool would not have known to keep his report quiet." He took a slow step forward, and though he made no move toward a weapon, something in the sheer physical fact of him, the width of his shoulders, the settled weight of his stance, made the 2 men behind Reeves shift their grips on their rifles. "You can stand in this trail if you like, Reeves. But by tomorrow the doctor's report and my own sworn word go to the mining inspector's office in Cascade Forks, and no amount of standing in trails is going to change what that crack in your dam is doing to this creek." For a long, tense moment nobody moved, the only sound the wind sighing through the pines and, far below, the faint murmur of the creek carrying its slow poison down toward the settlement. Then Reeves, calculating something behind his sour expression, stepped aside. "Mr. Prout will hear of this," he said. "I expect he will," Grant said, and took Elsie's arm, and they walked past the 3 armed men down the trail without either of them looking back, though Elsie's heart did not slow its hammering until they were well clear of the timber and back among their tethered horses. "That was either very brave or very foolish," she said, once they were mounted and moving. "Both, most likely," Grant said. "But it bought us time, and time is the one thing we did not have an hour ago." They rode for Cascade Forks that same afternoon, 12 miles down the wagon road that ran alongside the gorge, intending to lay the doctor's account and their own observations before the county recorder, and send word on to the territorial mining inspector. And it was on the return journey, in the last violet light of evening, riding the high trail above the trestle bridge that carried Prout's ore carts down to the rail depot, that they heard the sound that turned Elsie's blood to ice. A high, grinding shriek of metal growing louder, coming down the steep incline from the Sentinel Mine's loading platform far above. "Runaway cart," Grant said, already wheeling his horse toward the sound. "Someone has let the brake go, or it has failed." Below them, on the flat ground at the base of the incline, where the ore carts normally slowed to be transferred onto the bridge, Elsie could see a cluster of men working in the dusk, unaware yet of the disaster bearing down on them from above. Men she recognized even at this distance as bridge crew and rail hands loading the day's last shipment. Easily a dozen of them, with nowhere to run once that cart came off the grade at full speed and slammed into the loading platform where they stood. "Grant, they will be killed." "I know it," he said, and there was no fear in his voice, only the flat, focused calm of a man who had faced worse odds and lived. "There is a brake lever at the bottom of the grade, a hand switch that can throw the cart onto the spur track before it reaches the platform, but somebody has to reach it before that cart does, and it is coming down faster than any horse can outrun on this slope." "The old sheep trail," Elsie said suddenly. "My father's trail. It cuts straight down the face of the ridge, steep as sin, but it comes out right by the spur switch. No horse could take it, but a person on foot moving fast might beat that cart down by half a minute." Grant did not hesitate. "Show me." They left the horses and went down the old sheep trail together, half running, half sliding on loose scree, Grant's hand catching her elbow twice when her footing went, Elsie doing the same for him once when a rock gave way beneath his boot, the shriek of the runaway cart's wheels growing louder above them with every passing second. They came out onto the flat below the incline with the cart already visible, a black shape hurtling down the rails against the dying light, and Grant was moving before Elsie had even caught her breath, sprinting the last 30 yards to the iron switch lever while shouting at the top of his lungs for the men on the platform to clear. The men scattered, shouting in confusion and then in understanding, diving clear of the loading platform as the cart bore down, and Grant threw his whole weight against the switch lever, muscles standing out along his arms and shoulders as the old iron mechanism, stiff with disuse and rust, fought him for one agonizing second before giving way with a shuddering clang. The cart's wheels caught the diverted rail, and it hurtled past the platform and onto the spur track instead, still screaming with speed, and slammed at last into the earthen buffer mound. The miners kept at the spur's end for exactly this purpose, exploding into a shower of splintered ore and timber but killing no one, striking nothing but dirt and rock, the impact rolling out across the canyon in one final thunderous echo before silence fell. For a moment nobody moved. Then the men on the platform, realizing they were alive, began to shout and cheer, and Elsie ran the last few steps to Grant, who stood with his hands still locked around the switch lever, breathing hard, and threw her arms around him without a single thought for who might be watching. "You did it," she said into his chest. "You saved every one of them." "We did it," he said, holding her tight enough that she felt the tremor still running through his big frame, the aftershock of a man who had spent every ounce of strength he had in a single desperate effort. "Your father's trail saved us both the time we needed. I would have been too late without it." It was Reeves, of all people, who came stumbling down from the loading platform a few minutes later, his sour face gone pale and shaken, and it was Reeves who, when Grant demanded to know how a brake could simply fail on a cart that size, finally broke. "It did not fail," Reeves said, his voice unsteady. "Mr. Prout told me this afternoon, after you two came up from the tailings pond, that a cart was due down at dusk, and that the crew below would be occupied a good while clearing brush from the platform, and that if the brake happened to slip while they were not watching close, well, accidents did happen in mining country, and it would be a hard thing to prove otherwise." He would not meet either of their eyes. "I did not throw that brake myself. I could not do it, not with men I have worked beside 2 years standing under it. But I did not stop the man who did, either, and God forgive me for it, because I was afraid of losing my position if I crossed Mr. Prout. You will tell that to the mining inspector, Grant said, and to whatever marshal comes to hear it, or you will answer for a dozen deaths that very nearly happened tonight, Reeves, and no fear of losing a foreman's wage will excuse you before a judge. Reeves nodded, hollow-eyed, and did not argue. Silas Prout was arrested 11 days later, when the territorial mining inspector, arriving from Denver with a deputy marshal in tow, confirmed both the cracked tailings dam that Elsie and Grant had found and the engineer's suppressed report, dated 2 months prior, that had warned Prout in writing of exactly the failure that had since poisoned Larkspur Creek. Reeves testified, as Grant had told him he must, to the sabotaged break, and though Prout's lawyers argued long and loud in the county seat about jurisdiction and evidence, the plain physical fact of a poisoned creek and a nearly murdered work crew proved more persuasive than any lawyer's argument. The mine was placed under receivership pending repair of the tailings dam under proper oversight. Prout himself was bound over for trial on charges of criminal negligence and attempted murder, and the water claims he had spent 2 years quietly buying up and disputing reverted, under the territorial engineer's ruling, to their original filings, Elsie Crawford's ditch water among them, confirmed clean and legally hers with a formality her father had never lived to see completed. The children who had sickened recovered slowly, once the contaminated water was cut off and Doc Mercer had time to treat them properly, and by early June the whole canyon had water running clear and full for the first time in nearly 2 years, the drought finally breaking in a series of good, soaking rains that came at last without violence, filling the creek gently instead of drowning the canyon in flood. Elsie's orchard, meanwhile, had begun its slow return. The frost-killed blossoms of that first terrible spring had given way, as Grant had promised her they would, to a second flush of growth once the trees recovered from the shock of flood and freeze both, and the grafts he had taught her to set had taken hold along the damaged limbs, green and stubborn, and full of a future neither of them could have predicted on the night a flood first threw them together. She found him there one evening in late June, sitting on an overturned crate at the edge of the third row, her father's row, watching the last light catch the new leaves. "You look like a man with something on his mind," she said, settling beside him. "I have spent 11 years thinking I did not belong anywhere," Grant said, not looking away from the trees. "Not in the army anymore, not in any town, not among decent people who had never had to do the things I did to survive a war that never should have been fought the way it was fought. I built myself a cabin on that ridge because it seemed the safest place to be a man nobody else had any claim on, and nobody had to look at. And now I have spent 3 months watching a woman fight harder for 40 apple trees than most men I served with fought for their own lives," he said. "And I have come to think that a man who has spent his whole existence keeping himself apart from people might have been wrong about what kept him safe." He turned to face her and reached into his coat and drew out something small wrapped in a scrap of soft leather, which he unfolded to reveal a ring, plain silver, unadorned, clearly the work of a blacksmith rather than a jeweler, but polished with obvious care. "I am not a smooth-talking man," he said. "I have spent more of my life reading trail sign than reading poetry, and I do not know how to say this the way a proper suitor might. But I know I do not want to spend one more spring up on that mountain by myself, watching this canyon from a distance and calling that living. I want to be here with you, watching these trees you and your father built come back to life every year, for as many years as we are given. I love you, Elsie Crawford. I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it because you are the only woman I have known these past years. I say it because you are the first person I have met in a decade who made me want to stop being alone." Elsie looked at the ring, plain and honest, and at the man holding it, this feared and gentle giant who had promised her a better spring in the depths of her worst grief and had then spent every day since proving he meant to deliver on it, and found she had no doubts left in her at all. "I love you too," she said. "I loved you, I think, somewhere around the time you climbed a tree faster than I did to cut deadwood I could not reach, though I did not have sense enough to say so at the time." She held out her hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger, his big hands trembling slightly, and she laughed through sudden tears, happy ones this time, the first happy tears that Orchard had seen in longer than she cared to count. "Yes, Grant Wallace. Yes, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her there among the trees, slow and thorough, and when they finally drew apart, the last of the light was fading gold across the canyon walls, and somewhere down toward the settlement a dog barked, and a bird called from the willows along the creek, and the whole ordinary evening felt, to both of them, like the beginning of something neither flood nor frost, nor any greedy man's schemes would ever again have the power to take away. They were married the following month in the small clapboard church at Larkspur Crossing, with half the canyon in attendance, including a still-thin but recovering Dunmore boy who presented Elsie with a fistful of wildflowers he had picked himself, and Doc Mercer, who stood as near a witness as either of them had for family, since Elsie's parents were long gone, and Grant had none he claimed any more beyond the mountains themselves. Abel Foster wept unashamedly through the whole ceremony, and claimed afterward it was only the dust in his eyes. Grant did not give up his cabin on the ridge, and Elsie would not have asked him to, understanding by then that the high country was as much a part of him as her orchard was of her. But he built a second room onto her house down by the creek, wide enough for both of them, and for the life they intended to build together, and he split his days from then on between the trapping and guiding work that had sustained him alone for so many years and the steady, patient labor of helping her orchard grow stronger every season. She, in turn, learned to read weather the way he did, learned the particular stillness that meant a storm building in the high peaks, and found that a woman did not lose herself by loving a man who respected the ground she had chosen to stand on. By the time the following spring came around, the orchard bloomed fuller and whiter than it had in 5 years, every row heavy with blossom, no frost daring to touch a single branch, the creek running clear and full and legally, permanently hers, and Elsie Crawford Wallace stood among the flowering trees with her husband's arm around her shoulders, and thought that whatever the mountains and the drought and greedy men had tried to take from her, she had in the end been given back 100-fold. A home that was truly hers, a fight worth having fought, and a man who had promised her a better spring and had spent every single day since keeping his word.